It was a warm, sunny afternoon in the quiet suburbs of Tampa, Florida. The kind of day that made you forget all the noise of the world. Birds chirped in the trees, the occasional car hummed down the street, and the neighborhood felt peaceful, almost perfect. But inside the Collins family home, things couldn't have been further from peaceful. Jason Collins, a 38-year-old high school teacher, sat in his favorite armchair by the window. The golden rays of the afternoon sun bathed the room, but they did nothing to ease the heavy weight in his chest. It had been a year since his wife, Emily, had come into his life. They'd met in college, fallen in love, and after 5 years of dating, they'd gotten married. The two of them had built a life that seemed perfect on the outside. But Jason knew something had changed. Over the past few months, things had been different between them. Emily, who was once affectionate and loving, seemed distant, more distant than ever before. She had become obsessed with her career, often staying late at the office, attending events he was never invited to, and spending less and less time at home. Jason had tried to be understanding. After all, her career was taking off and she had big dreams. But the more she pushed him away, the more Jason began to wonder if there was something more going on. The thought gnawed at him. He tried to talk to her about it, but the conversation always ended in her brushing it off or giving him some excuse. He didn't want to seem paranoid, but the little things started adding up. The locked phone, the sudden trips out of town for work, the way she had stopped being as intimate with him. It was like they were living in two separate worlds, and Jason was stuck in the quiet, lonely one. It wasn't until one evening, when Jason came home early from a meeting, that everything changed. Jason had decided to surprise Emily. He'd been working late for the past few weeks and thought he'd take the night off to spend time with her. But as he walked through the door of their house, a strange unease settled in his stomach. The lights were on in the living room, but the house was eerily quiet. Emily's car was in the driveway, so she should have been home. He called out her name, but there was no response. It wasn't until he heard muffled voices coming from upstairs that his heart dropped. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Quietly, he climbed the stairs, his hand gripping the railing as he moved toward their bedroom. And that's when he saw it. The door was ajar just enough for him to see inside. Through the crack, he could see Emily, his wife, in a compromising position with another man. His breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to stop as he watched the scene unfold, his mind racing, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just some random encounter. This was premeditated. Emily knew he was coming home. She had deliberately invited this man over while Jason had taken the night off to be with her. The betrayal was not just in the act, but in the deception, in the lies, in the way she had hidden this from him. Jason's anger surged, but he remained frozen for a moment, staring at the scene in disbelief. Emily, the woman he had loved and trusted for over a decade, was now in bed with another man. The man's voice was familiar to Jason. He knew him from the gym. It was Tom, Emily's personal trainer. Jason had met him once at a work event. He had no idea that their professional relationship had crossed the line into something more. As the reality of the situation set in, Jason's chest tightened. His eyes shifted to Emily, who seemed completely unaware of his presence. Her eyes were closed, and she seemed to be enjoying the moment, as if Jason didn't even exist. Jason's mind raced. He wanted to confront them, to scream at them both. But the sight of them together left him paralyzed with a mix of rage and sadness. His mind flashed back to all the good times they had shared, the laughter, the vacations, the quiet moments together. How had it all fallen apart so quickly? When had he become a stranger to her? But the longer Jason stood there, the clearer his thoughts became. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal of everything he had built with her. Their entire relationship was based on trust, and she had shattered it. The woman he had once called his best friend, his partner, had now become a stranger in his eyes. As the minutes passed, the anger began to build, and Jason knew he couldn't just stand there anymore. He took a deep breath and slowly stepped back, leaving the door ajar so he could make his exit without being seen. He needed to process this. He couldn't confront her now. He wasn't ready. But when the time came, he would make sure she knew what she had done. Jason's head was spinning as he walked down the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the front door, he paused. He knew he couldn't stay there tonight. The house felt like a prison, and he needed space to think. He grabbed his keys and left, walking out into the cool night air, leaving the life he had known behind for the first time. As Jason drove through the dark streets, his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He wasn't sure if he could forgive her, but he knew he had to confront the truth. Emily had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and now Jason had to find out if their marriage could be saved, or if this was the end. The next few days were a blur of confusion, anger, and sleepless nights. Jason avoided Emily's calls, trying to process everything that had happened. He didn't want to face her, not yet. Not until he had the strength to look her in the eyes and ask the questions that had been gnawing at him. Finally, after 3 days of silence, Emily showed up at his door, looking as desperate as Jason felt. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her voice trembled as she tried to explain herself. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It just happened." Jason stood there, staring at her, his heart torn between the love he had once felt and the anger that now consumed him. "It just happened? Is that really your explanation? That it just happened?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but Jason held up his hand, stopping her. "No, I need time. I need space. I can't talk to you right now." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing on the doorstep. It was clear that their relationship would never be the same again. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Emily had crossed a line, and Jason wasn't sure he could ever forgive her. Days passed after that confrontation with Emily, but Jason could barely remember the last time he felt any peace. The weight of the betrayal hung over him like a dark cloud. His days were filled with unease, his mind constantly replaying the images of Emily and Tom, her personal trainer, in their bed. It felt surreal to him that the woman he thought he knew and loved for so long could betray him so coldly. He had trusted her, and now that trust felt like a distant memory. Jason had always prided himself on being patient, understanding, and forgiving. That's the kind of man he wanted to be, someone who didn't let anger rule his decisions. But right now, in this moment of deep emotional turmoil, he didn't know who he was anymore. He felt like a shell of himself, barely holding on to the man he used to be. His friends had reached out to him, worried, but Jason didn't have the strength to talk. He couldn't bring himself to confide in anyone, not yet. But as the days dragged on, Jason realized something had to give. He couldn't hide away forever, avoiding the pain, pretending everything was fine. He had to confront the reality of his situation, whatever that might mean for the future of his marriage. It was a week after Emily's last attempt at a conversation when Jason found himself standing outside their home once more, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily had left him several voicemails, but he hadn't responded. He couldn't decide what he wanted. What did he want from her? Answers? Closure? Revenge? As he walked through the door, he could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Emily was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of the guilt was crushing her. But Jason knew that the tears didn't change what had happened. They didn't make it go away. "Jason?" Her voice was shaky, filled with so much remorse, it almost broke him. Almost. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe anger, maybe indifference, but it wasn't what he thought. His heart ached for her, but at the same time, it was as if she had already betrayed him beyond repair. "I need to hear it from you," he said, his voice low, almost quiet. "I need you to tell me what happened, Emily. I need you to tell me why." Her eyes met his, and for a second it felt like old times. Like the love they had was still there, just buried under the rubble of her lies. But then she spoke, and it was like a knife twisted in his chest. "I don't know, Jason," she said, her voice cracking. "I was confused. I got caught up in it all. Tom, he made me feel important, you know? Like I mattered." Jason wanted to shout at her, to ask how she could say such things. But all he could do was stand there, his fists clenched at his sides, fighting back the rage that was rising within him. So what? You were bored with me? You didn't think I mattered anymore? His voice was colder than he intended, but it cut through the air with sharp finality. He could feel his heart sinking into his stomach. No, Jason. It's not that simple, she said, her voice almost pleading now. I never meant for it to happen. I just got so wrapped up in everything. And Tom, he made me feel like I could be something more. Something I wasn't in our marriage. Jason closed his eyes, trying to control the wave of emotions crashing through him. He wanted to walk away, to leave her there with her excuses, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He needed closure, even if it hurt. He had to understand how his whole world had fallen apart in such a short amount of time. But that doesn't explain why you lied to me, why you hid it all. You could have told me, Emily. We could have worked through this together. She bit her lip, her hands trembling as she reached out, trying to touch him. But Jason stepped back. He couldn't allow himself to feel pity for her. He couldn't. I wasn't honest with myself, she said quietly. I thought I was doing the right thing, Jason. I thought I could juggle everything. My career, my marriage, my personal life. But I was wrong. And now look at us. Jason could feel the anger building up in his chest, but he held it back. He didn't want to get into a screaming match with her. It wouldn't change anything. All he wanted was answers. But the more she spoke, the more he realized how deep the betrayal ran. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a series of choices, all leading to one devastating truth. He shook his head. You never told me how unhappy you were. You never gave me the chance to fix things. Instead, you pushed me away, and all the while, you were sleeping with him. Emily closed her eyes, her face contorting in guilt. I'm sorry, Jason. I'm so sorry. I should have communicated better. But by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late. Jason took a deep breath, steadying himself. He was about to say something, but before he could, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. His heart skipped a beat. It was Tom, her personal trainer. Jason's pulse quickened as the man stepped out of the car, his confident stride heading straight for the front door. This was it. This was the moment. Jason looked at Emily, the anger in his eyes now undeniable. Is he coming inside? Emily hesitated, and Jason didn't wait for her answer. He marched to the door, swinging it open just as Tom was about to knock. The sight of the man who had played such a significant role in the destruction of Jason's life made his blood boil. Tom froze, his eyes wide with surprise as he looked between Jason and Emily. What's going on, Jason? He asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Jason's eyes locked onto his, and without a word, he pushed past Tom, stepping out onto the porch. I think we need to talk. Tom's smirk faltered as he took a step back, clearly taken aback by Jason's aggression. What the hell is this about? Jason's fist clenched. You think you can just waltz into my life and take everything from me? You think you can sleep with my wife and face no consequences? Tom raised his hands, attempting to defuse the situation, but Jason wasn't having it. Stay the hell away from her. Stay the hell away from my life. Emily stood at the doorway, watching helplessly as Jason and Tom exchanged tense words. For the first time, Emily understood that she had lost everything. Her marriage, her husband, and now even her lover's patience. Jason's heart raced as he turned back to face Emily, the pain in his eyes evident. I want a divorce, he said quietly, the words feeling like a weight lifting off his chest. Emily stared at him, her lips trembling. Jason, no. Please. I'll do anything. I'll change. But Jason was already walking away, his decision made. He had nothing left to give her. It was over. As Jason stepped away from the home he had once shared with Emily, he knew there was no turning back. The future was uncertain, but he couldn't go back to the man he was before. Not after everything that had happened. The road ahead was his to walk. And this time he was walking alone. Don't forget to like, share, and comment below. If you want to see more stories like this, Make sure to subscribe to my channel for updates. As the days went by, tension mounted. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that things were slowly unraveling. His life, his marriage, everything he'd worked for. Jessica had made her choice. She was with John Preston, the man who'd betrayed him. But it wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the web of lies, the way she'd turned their entire relationship into a farce. The anger simmered inside Derek, and it seemed there was no outlet, no way to vent it. One afternoon, as he sat in his flat, the doorbell rang. Derek wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment he thought it might be some kind of prank, maybe someone trying to get under his skin. But when he opened the door, he was faced with an unexpected sight. James, his son, or the man he thought was his son, was standing on his doorstep. The young man was fidgeting with his jacket, clearly nervous, but there was a determination in his eyes. "Dad," James started, his voice hesitant. "We need to talk." Derek's heart skipped. The moment he saw James, the flood of emotions came rushing back. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief that he'd spent all these years thinking he was raising his own son when in fact, he was just a pawn in Jessica's game. But this was different. James was here now, standing before him, seeking answers. "I thought I told you to stay away," Derek replied, his voice cold, but his hands shaking. "Why are you here?" "I need to know the truth," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About why you left, why you didn't come back. She's not the same, Dad. She's not the woman I knew." Derek felt his resolve cracking. He didn't want to feel sorry for her, but hearing that his son, the one he'd raised, was struggling with the fallout from everything that had happened, made him feel a sense of duty. He owed it to James to explain, to give him the answers he deserved. "I don't even know where to start," Derek muttered, stepping aside to let James in. He ran a hand through his hair and gestured to the small kitchen table. "Sit down. Let me tell you what happened." James sat down, looking at Derek with a mix of curiosity and confusion. The young man had always been told that his father was distant, that he was the one who had left them. But the truth, Derek knew, was far more complicated. Derek took a deep breath and began recounting the events that had brought him to this point. He talked about the strain in his marriage, the long hours at work, and how Jessica had pushed him away. But it wasn't until John Preston had entered the picture that everything had started to collapse. "She was having an affair with him, James," Derek said, his voice faltering as he admitted it out loud. "I found out in the worst possible way. I watched it happen. I saw them together in our own house, in our own bed." James's face twisted in shock. "Wait, you mean she—" He couldn't finish his sentence, his face paling. "Yeah," Derek confirmed, nodding grimly. "I caught them red-handed, and I made sure everyone knew about it. I wasn't going to let her get away with this, not after everything I'd done for her." The air between them grew heavy with silence as James tried to process what he was hearing. "But why didn't you just leave? You could have walked away from her." "I should have," Derek said quietly. "But she had a way of convincing me. For so many years I convinced myself that things would change, that we could fix it. But I was wrong. I've been wrong about so many things." James looked at Derek for a long moment, the weight of the truth settling in. "So you didn't just leave because of the affair, did you? There's more to it." Derek paused, then nodded. "There's always more to it, James. It wasn't just the affair. It was the way she humiliated me. The way she made me feel like I wasn't enough. And I stayed. I stayed because I thought I was supposed to be the good husband, the one who forgives, who works through the hard times. But I let her drag me down, and I let her take everything from me." As Derek spoke, James's expression softened, and Derek could see the struggle in his son's eyes. He could see the realization sinking in. This wasn't just about the affair. This was about the betrayal of trust, the years of manipulation, the lies that had been woven so intricately. "I had to make a choice, James," Derek continued. "I had to choose whether to stay in a marriage built on lies, or walk away and rebuild my life, no matter how hard it was. And I chose to leave. But I didn't expect everything to get so complicated. The door opened behind them, and Wendy walked in. She stood there for a moment, watching the scene unfold before her. Derek knew this moment was coming. He'd wanted to tell her everything. But now, seeing James here, hearing his son struggle with the truth, it made him realize how much he'd kept buried, how much he'd kept hidden even from Wendy. "Is everything okay?" Wendy asked, her voice soft, as she set down a bag of groceries. Derek glanced over at her, his eyes filled with emotion. James needed to know the truth. Wendy nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. She reached over, placing a hand on Derek's shoulder, and then sat down next to him. There was no need for words. She understood him in ways he hadn't realized before, and her presence felt like the first step toward healing, toward rebuilding. James looked between the two of them, his gaze lingering on Wendy for a moment longer than necessary. "So, you two? Is this?" Derek nodded, his voice steady now. "Yes, James. Wendy's been there for me when I needed someone the most. And she's not just a friend." James nodded slowly, his eyes searching Derek's face for any sign of hesitation. "I guess that makes sense. After everything that happened with Mom, I just didn't expect this." "It's complicated," Derek admitted, a rueful smile crossing his lips. "But life's complicated, James. It always has been. And sometimes, the best thing we can do is try to make sense of it, even when it seems impossible." James was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "I get it now. I get why you left her. And I understand why you had to go, even if it hurt." Derek let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you, son. I know I've made mistakes, but I've always tried to do the right thing by you." There was a moment of silence, and then James stood up, offering a hand to Derek. "You know, I might not have been your real son, but I always looked up to you. I always will." Derek took his son's hand, a weight lifting off his shoulders as he realized the path forward might not be so difficult after all. The damage had been done, yes, but there was still a chance for reconciliation. "Thanks, James," Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." Before they could say anything else, Wendy stood up, her arms wide, welcoming both of them into her embrace. "I think it's time we start fresh, together." And with that, the three of them stood there, united in a moment that had taken years to reach. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with its own challenges. But Derek knew one thing for sure. This time, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. The weeks after that conversation were a blur for Derek. The tension between him and Jessica had begun to dissipate, but that didn't mean the weight of it was gone. Every time he saw James, there was a reminder of the past, of everything that had been lost and what could never be reclaimed. But there was also something else, something stronger than regret. It was a sense of resolve, a determination to find peace, even if it meant moving on from the woman who had broken his heart. James had moved out of the house, and Derek had moved into the flat full-time, the quiet of his new life unsettling at first but gradually becoming a source of solace. Wendy had been a constant, her gentle presence a balm for his wounds. Still, as much as he found comfort in her, there was an unease that wouldn't leave him. He couldn't forget the humiliation, the lies that had led him to this point. One evening, just as the sky was beginning to turn a pale pink, Derek got a message. It was from Jessica, a single line, "We need to talk." His first instinct was to ignore it, to shut it out. But something about the words kept him from doing so. They weren't just words. They were a reminder that no matter how far he had come, there were things left unresolved, questions that still lingered. His heart pounded as he typed a simple response. When and where? An hour later, he found himself standing outside the small cafe they used to frequent, the one where they had shared countless cups of coffee during their early years together. The place hadn't changed much. It was still the same quaint spot with creaky wooden floors and a faint smell of cinnamon in the air. But everything about it felt different now. The chairs were the same, but the warmth they used to share had long since evaporated. He spotted her immediately. Jessica was sitting in the back corner, her eyes downcast, her hands fidgeting with a napkin. She looked thinner, older, more fragile than the woman he remembered. It was a stark contrast to the confident, determined woman who had once controlled every part of their life together. Derek hesitated at the door, but then pushed it open and walked in. He made his way toward her, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he sat down, she lifted her eyes to meet his, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of the woman he once loved. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "I almost didn't," Derek replied, his voice steady but cold. "But here we are." Jessica nodded, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. Answers, perhaps, or forgiveness. Derek couldn't say what she saw, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to go back. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. "I owe you an apology," Jessica said after a long pause, her words tentative. "For everything. For what I did to you. I never meant to hurt you, Derek. You were always good to me." The words were empty, and he could hear the truth beneath them. She was sorry for what she'd done, but that didn't mean she understood the full extent of the pain she'd caused. It was always the same with Jessica. Apologies, excuses, but never real accountability. "I don't need your apology," Derek replied, his tone hardening. "What you did isn't something you can fix with words. Not anymore." She recoiled slightly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't know what else to do, Derek. I was lost. I thought I needed someone else, and now I see how wrong I was." Derek leaned back in his chair, staring at her as she struggled to find the right words. "You're not the person I thought you were," he said finally. "And I can't keep pretending that I don't know what you did. You betrayed me, Jessica. Not just with John, but with everything you promised." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Jessica swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the table as if she couldn't bear to look at him anymore. Derek could see the cracks in her facade, the vulnerable woman who had once been so sure of herself now unraveling before him. "I wasn't just hurt by what you did," Derek continued, his voice steady now. "I was humiliated. You lied to me, Jessica. You made me feel like I wasn't enough, and when I needed you most, you chose him. And for what? Some fleeting excitement? Some temporary fix?" The silence between them was deafening, and for a moment, Derek wondered if he was pushing too hard. But the anger had been building for years, and now, finally, it was spilling out. "I don't want your apologies anymore," Derek said, his voice firm. "I don't want your excuses. What I want is for you to understand that I'm done. I've spent too long living in the shadow of your lies. It's time for me to move on." Jessica's face crumpled as the weight of his words settled over her. "Please, Derek. Please don't leave me like this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Derek stood up, his heart heavy but resolute. "It's too late for that. Goodbye, Jessica." He turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there, staring after him. For the first time in years, Derek felt a sense of finality. The chains that had held him down for so long had been broken. He wasn't going back to the past. He was ready for the future. The days that followed were a mixture of relief and uncertainty for Derek. Walking away from Jessica had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. For so long, he had been caught in a web of lies and betrayal, and now, with each step away from that cafe, he felt a little freer, a little more himself. Yet there was a part of him that still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over. The conversation with Jessica had left too many questions, too much unfinished business. But no matter how much he tried to push it out of his mind, his thoughts kept circling back to what he'd left behind. His life, his family, and the man he'd become in their wake. Derek knew he had to confront his past head-on. The pieces were falling into place, but there was one more confrontation that needed to happen, one more truth that had to be exposed. For months now, he had buried his anger and his pain beneath a thin veil of acceptance. But it was time for that to end. It was time for the final showdown, the one that would change everything. As he drove home that evening, the familiar hum of the engine did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. He needed answers. He needed closure. And the person who could give him those answers was John Preston. John had been the architect of everything. The one who had manipulated Jessica, who had played on her insecurities and desires, all while using his power to control the very course of Derek's life. Derek had spent years in the shadow of Preston's influence, but now it was time to face the man who had stolen everything from him. The day was approaching when he would confront Preston in the one place he never thought possible. Derek's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Wendy. "Everything okay?" For a moment, Derek just stared at the message, the weight of everything he had been through settling in. He knew he wasn't okay, but the moment had arrived. There was no turning back now. He typed a quick reply, "Not yet, but it will be." Wendy's reply came almost immediately, "Be careful." Derek chuckled softly to himself, the warmth of her words offering some comfort. But he knew that this next step would be anything but careful. He had to do what needed to be done, no matter the cost. The next morning, Derek found himself standing outside the sleek office building where John Preston worked. The glass and steel structure gleamed in the morning sun, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the emotions churning inside Derek. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew it was time to confront the man who had ruined his life. Taking a deep breath, he walked inside. The security guard behind the desk barely glanced up as Derek approached. With a nod, Derek made his way toward the elevator, the metallic doors sliding open with a soft chime. As the elevator ascended, Derek's thoughts turned to the past, to the things he had tried to bury, the questions he had ignored for far too long. It was time to stop running. The doors opened with a soft ding, and Derek stepped out into the sterile, high-rise lobby of the corporate offices. He walked past sleek glass panels, catching glimpses of the quiet workers sitting at their desks, their heads down, focused on their tasks. Nobody seemed to notice him or care, but Derek's mind was focused on one thing and one thing only: Preston. When Derek reached the receptionist, he asked, "Where's John Preston's office?" The receptionist looked up, her expression barely changing as she tapped a few keys on her keyboard. "He's in a meeting, but I can check if he's available," she said in a clipped tone. "No need," Derek replied, his voice steady but tense. "I'll wait." He walked toward the sitting area, where a few plush chairs were arranged around a low glass table. Derek sank into one, his eyes scanning the space around him, every detail sharp and clear. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. This was it. He had waited so long for this moment. And when it came, it would be the end of everything. Minutes felt like hours as Derek waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the door to Preston's office opened, and out walked a man with a stern expression, looking every bit the part of a corporate giant. Derek didn't need to be told who he was. John Preston had an air about him that made it impossible to mistake him for anyone else. As Preston approached, Derek stood. The two men locked eyes, a quiet tension hanging in the air. "Derek Callahan," Preston said, a faint trace of surprise in his voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." "No, I imagine you didn't," Derek replied, his voice cold. "We need to talk." Preston smirked, clearly amused. "About what exactly?" "The fact that I've taken everything from you." "You took more than that," Derek said, his voice growing more intense. "You destroyed everything I had. My career, my marriage, my life, and you're going to pay for it." For a moment, Preston seemed unfazed. But then Derek stepped forward, his anger rising with each word. "You thought you could control me, manipulate me, use me like a pawn in your little game. But I'm not playing anymore. This ends today." Preston's smirk faltered as Derek's words hit him with more weight than he expected. "You think you can just waltz in here and threaten me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Derek stepped even closer, his eyes narrowing as he locked onto Preston's. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who spent his life hiding behind power and control, using it to destroy anyone who stands in his way. But not anymore. Not with me." The air between them crackled with tension. Derek's chest was tight, his fists clenched, but he kept his composure. This was it, the final confrontation, and he wasn't backing down. Preston, now visibly shaken, took a step back. "You think you can destroy me? You're nothing." Derek's voice was firm. I already have. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, turning the screen toward Preston. On it was the video that had destroyed Preston's reputation. Derek had made sure it was sent to every relevant media outlet, to every person who had ever believed in the lie Preston had created. Now it was too late for him to hide. Preston's face drained of color as he saw the video, his arrogance faltering. Your game is over, Derek said, and I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly who you are. In this tense moment, Derek knew he had crossed the point of no return. His life had been shattered by lies and betrayal, but now he had a chance to make it right. The pieces were falling into place, and as he stood there, confronting the man who had destroyed him, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for himself. Derek stood there, watching John Preston's face twist from that smug arrogance to something closer to panic. For years, Preston had walked through life with a sense of entitlement, believing that his power over others was unshakable. But now, as the realization set in, it was clear that his world was crumbling. The video Derek had captured was the final nail in Preston's coffin. The footage was damning. It showed not just the affair, but the extent of the manipulation, the power Preston had used to control Jessica and, by extension, Derek's life. Derek had made sure it was sent to every relevant news outlet, ensuring that everyone who had ever been a part of Preston's twisted little world would know the truth. Preston's eyes darted from the phone screen back to Derek. The confident, arrogant man Derek had known for years was gone, replaced by something far less certain. You think this is going to ruin me? Preston said, his voice wavering. Derek felt a sharp thrill run through him. For so long, he had been trapped under Preston's influence, always the pawn in his game. But now the tables had turned. Derek wasn't the one who had to hide anymore. I don't think it's going to ruin you, Derek said, a cold smile on his lips. I know it is. Preston opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He closed it, his jaw tightening as if he was searching for something to hold on to. Derek didn't need to hear him speak anymore. The power was in his hands now, and he intended to make sure that Preston felt the weight of it. For so long, Derek had been the one who was controlled, the one who had to swallow his anger and frustration. But now, standing before Preston, everything felt different. This was his moment. This was the moment when he could finally take back what was rightfully his. Do you know what I've learned, Preston? Derek asked, his voice low but steady. I've learned that people like you, people who think they can control others, who use their power to destroy lives, they're nothing without their power. And when it's gone, they're nothing but empty shells. The room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning, a stark contrast to the rising storm in Derek's chest. His pulse was racing, but there was something exhilarating about standing in the face of the man who had tried to break him. It was the moment he had been waiting for. Preston tried to recover, his eyes narrowing as he finally found his voice again. You think this is over? He spat, his tone venomous. You think you can just destroy my life with a video? Do you have any idea who I am? Derek took a step forward, his posture firm, his voice cutting through Preston's bluster. I know exactly who you are. You're a man who hides behind power and control. You think your money, your position, your connections will protect you from the consequences of your actions. But it won't. Not anymore. Preston's expression twisted with rage. You don't know what you're doing, he snarled. You're making a mistake. You're just another bitter, weak man who can't accept the fact that he was outplayed. Derek's gaze hardened. I'm not weak, and I didn't get played. I just woke up. I've spent far too long living in your shadow, letting you dictate the terms of my life. But not anymore. And you? Derek gestured at Preston with disgust. You're not going to walk away from this unscathed. Preston's face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear, but Derek wasn't finished. You wanted to destroy me, to break my spirit. But here's the truth. You're the one who's broken. You've always been broken. And now, everyone will know who you really are. With those words hanging in the air, Derek turned and walked out of the office. He didn't look back, knowing that this moment, this confrontation, was his victory. He had finally taken control of his own life again. The storm that had been raging inside him for years was beginning to subside, leaving behind a sense of peace. But there was still one thing left to do. The next few days were a blur for Derek. As Preston's world continued to unravel, Derek felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The media coverage of the affair and the subsequent fallout was everywhere, on the news, social media, and in every conversation that seemed to take place. Derek didn't care about the attention, though. He didn't care about the vindication either. What mattered was that he had finally taken back what was his. He checked his phone constantly, watching as the story spread, Preston's career destroyed, his reputation irreparably damaged. The video had done its job, and now the world could see Preston for what he truly was. But Derek wasn't just focused on Preston's downfall. He was focused on his own future. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about moving forward. The weight of everything he had endured was still there, but it was beginning to feel lighter. He thought about Wendy. Her unwavering support through everything had been the one constant in his life. In the aftermath of everything, she was his rock, the one person who had stood by him when the rest of the world had turned its back. Derek knew that he was ready to start over, to leave the past behind him and embrace the future with someone who truly cared for him. It was a week later when Derek finally met with Wendy to discuss their future. He had taken some time to reflect, to process everything that had happened, and now he was ready to make the decision that would shape the rest of his life. He sat across from Wendy, the soft glow of the restaurant's lighting casting a warm hue on her face. There was a sense of peace between them now, a calm that hadn't been there before. The chaos of the past few weeks seemed distant, a memory that had been burned away by the clarity of the present moment. Wendy smiled at him, her eyes full of understanding. "So, what do you think? What's next for you?" Derek took a deep breath, his hands resting on the table, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. I think I'm ready to move on, to really start fresh. And I want to do that with you, Wendy." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her features before she smiled even brighter. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Derek replied, his voice steady and sincere. Wendy reached across the table and took his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "Then let's do it. Let's make this new beginning count." As the days passed, Derek and Wendy began to build a life together. It wasn't easy. There were challenges, adjustments, and moments where the shadows of the past seemed to loom large. But they faced it all together. Derek had learned that the road to healing wasn't linear. Sometimes it took time, sometimes it took patience, but in the end, it was worth it. And as for Preston, well, his reputation continued to spiral downward, his career a cautionary tale of what happens when power and arrogance blind a man to his own flaws. But Derek didn't care about Preston anymore. He was done with that part of his life. It was time for a new chapter, one where Derek Callahan was the hero of his own story. As Derek and Wendy started their new life together, the weight of the past seemed to lift just a little more each day. The battles he had fought, the betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, had left their marks on him, but they no longer defined him. He had done what many men would never have been able to do. He had confronted the source of his torment and, through sheer will and resilience, emerged victorious. But the victory wasn't just about the destruction of Preston or the unraveling of a life that had been built on deceit. No, the real victory for Derek was in the transformation he had undergone. He had gone from a man who was controlled, manipulated, and broken by another's power to someone who took back the reins of his life. His entire perspective had shifted, and with that shift came a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just the victim of his circumstances. He was the author of his own future. Months passed. Derek's life with Wendy began to feel like a dream, one he had never dared to imagine during the darkest days of his marriage. They had made their home together in a quiet town, far from the chaos of his past. The house was small but cozy, filled with the simple joys of a life well lived. They spent weekends walking in the park, cooking meals together, and talking about everything and nothing at all. Wendy had been his unwavering support. She had helped him rediscover the man he had lost in the turmoil of his marriage. She was patient with him when he needed time to heal, and she stood by his side when the world felt too heavy to bear. With her, he had found something he never thought possible: peace. But it wasn't just about healing. It was about embracing the new possibilities life had to offer. Derek had taken up painting again, something he had abandoned years ago. He found a quiet joy in the strokes of color on the canvas, in creating something that was entirely his. It was a way of expressing the emotions he had kept hidden for so long, a way of transforming pain into something beautiful. Wendy had her own dreams, too. She had always loved animals, and in the months following their move, she started volunteering at a local animal shelter. Derek often joined her, helping to care for the animals and get them ready for adoption. The work was fulfilling, and they both found a sense of purpose in giving back. As the year came to a close, Derek received a letter. It was from his son, James. It had been months since Derek had seen or spoken to him. After the revelations about Jessica's past, James had struggled to process everything. The truth about his mother's infidelity, the paternity test, the fallout. It had all been too much for him. But now, with time and distance, he was ready to reach out. The letter was simple but heartfelt. James apologized for the way things had ended, for not being there when Derek needed him the most. He acknowledged the pain his actions had caused and expressed a desire to reconnect. The letter ended with an invitation. James wanted to meet Derek, to sit down and have a real conversation, to finally mend the broken bond between them. Derek read the letter several times, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He had spent so many years running from the truth, hiding from the past, that the thought of facing it head-on was both terrifying and liberating. He was no longer the angry man who had once cut ties with his son. He was someone new, someone who had learned that forgiveness, even when it seemed impossible, was the key to finding peace. Wendy, ever supportive, was by his side when he made the decision. "You can do this," she told him, her voice full of warmth. "You've come so far. It's time to heal the last part of your past." The day of the meeting, Derek found himself standing outside a quiet cafe, waiting for James. The nerves were there, the old doubts and insecurities creeping back. But he was determined to face them. When he saw James walking towards him, a flood of emotions hit. His son had changed, grown into a man, but there was still that familiar look in his eyes, a mix of uncertainty and hope. James smiled, his eyes locking with Derek's. "Hey, Dad." Derek smiled back, a small, tentative smile, but one that spoke volumes. "Hey, James." The two of them stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. It was awkward, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the beginning of something new. They sat down at the table, and for the next hour they talked. There were no grand revelations, no dramatic confessions. Just two men, trying to rebuild a relationship that had been broken by lies and misunderstandings. James spoke about his struggles, about how he had come to terms with the truth. Derek shared his own journey, the pain of betrayal, and the healing that had come with time. By the end of the conversation, something had shifted. The walls between them had started to crumble, and the bond that had been severed for so long began to stitch itself back together, thread by fragile thread. James stood up to leave, and before he could walk away, he turned to his father. "Thanks, Dad, for giving me a second chance." Derek nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You never lost it, James. You never lost it." As Derek walked back to his car, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not in the dramatic victories he had won over Preston, but in the quiet, personal victories that truly mattered. The reconciliation with his son, the new life he had built with Wendy, the ability to forgive himself for the mistakes of the past. These were the things that defined him now. There was still pain, of course. He would never forget the betrayal, the years of manipulation, the damage that had been done. But he had learned to live with it, to use it as a foundation for growth instead of a prison. He was no longer a man defined by his past mistakes. He was a man who had embraced change, learned from his struggles, and emerged stronger because of them. As he drove home that evening, with the setting sun casting a warm glow across the road, Derek realized something. He was free. He had finally, truly broken free from the chains of his past. And as he pulled into the driveway and saw Wendy standing there, waiting for him, he knew that this was just the beginning. There was a whole future ahead of him, and for the first time in years, he was ready to embrace it. As the story comes to a close, Derek's journey of pain, betrayal, and redemption leaves us with a final lesson. We are all capable of change. We all have the power to take control of our lives, to overcome the obstacles in our path, and to start over, no matter how deep the scars of our past may be. If you've enjoyed Derek's journey and would like to see more stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.